My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Do archeological finds into the earliest forms of shamanism and sacred sites provide evidence that ancient peoples had contact with extraterrestrial or transdimensional beings? Researchers and authors Andrew Collins and Gregory L. show how, again and again, our ancestors built permanent sites of ceremonial activity where geomagnetic and gravitational anomalies have been recorded. They investigate how the earliest forms of animism and shamanism began at sites like Denisova Cave in the Altai mountains of Siberia and Qesem Cave in Israel more than 400,000 years ago. My special guest on Destination Unlimited this week, Andrew Collins, shares his collaboration with Greg Little in their new book, Origins of the Gods. Greg Little is the author of more than 30 books, including Denisovan Origins, co-authored with Andrew Collins. His research has been featured on the National Geographic Channel, MSNBC, Discovery, and the History Channel. He lives in Memphis, Tennessee. Andrew Collins is a science and history writer who has been investigating the origins of human civilization since 1995. He's the co-discoverer of a massive cave complex beneath the Giza Plateau, now known as Collins Cave. The author of several books, including Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. He lives in Essex, England. He's also a frequent guest expert on the History Channel's Ancient Aliens and the Unexplained. His website is andrewcollins.com, and he joins me to share his groundbreaking work and new collaboration with Gregory Little, Origins of the Gods, Qesem Cave, Skinwalkers, and Contact with Transdimensional Intelligences. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Andrew Collins. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, Victor. Good to be with you.
Andrew, before we begin discussing your calling to this important work and your latest book, Origins of the Gods, you have some events coming up this month and in September. Please share with our listeners about these events.
Yes, I shall be in Blackpool in the north of England on June 24th, 26th for a very big event, not just in Britain, but in Europe as a whole, which is called Awakening Expo. I shall be one of the lead speakers alongside Eric von Daniken, Giorgio from Ancient Aliens, and various other of my colleagues in a big 3-day event where I'll also be launching physically in this country the new book Origins of the Gods, which is co-authored with my friend and colleague Greg Little. So then in September, I'm coming to the States. I shall be in Boulder, Colorado, for a big event for Gaia TV and their show Ancient Civilizations. That's in September. All details will be on my website. It's something that's just been confirmed completely. So I should be putting everything up in the next few days, but the dates are already up there.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Andrew, please tell us about your path and how it led to your passion for investigating the origins of ancient civilizations.
Well, I started off as a UFO investigator back in the 1970s, and I investigated all sorts of cases, but within a year or so, I was being sent all over the country looking and researching at some of the top cases that would occur, the high strangeness ones. I was working for the British UFO Research Association, Flying Saucer magazine, and also the UFO Investigators Network. And I got a very good idea of, what was happening in the UFO phenomenon. But the trouble is that at that time, I believed everything was nuts and bolts spacecraft and flesh and blood aliens. I believe that UFOs were scout craft. I believe that there were motherships, orbiting Earth, and any tiny objects that were seen were probes sent out from, bigger craft. But I began to realize that this was not, quite right, because a lot of people that were seeing objects at close quarters seemed to have a psychic background. In other words, they had also seen ghosts. They had experienced astral projection. They could feel presences in places. And I couldn't understand why these people seemed to be favoured for UFO encounters. But in addition to that, there are a number of cases that were coming up where the objects were somehow responding to the observation of the witnesses. In other words, simply by connecting in mind to them, the objects were not only responding by moving differently or coming closer, but they also seemed to be communicating a sense of connection between themselves and the object. Now, this didn't make any sense to me at all, because, if you observe a helicopter flying over, you don't feel any personal connection with it. You just look at it, you observe it, and it passes and goes, away, even if it's hovering for a while. But with UFOs, it seemed to be different. It was almost as if the objects seemed to be sentient in nature. And this was something that I wrote about by the end of the 1970s, the psychic nature of UFOs. And it was something that I pondered on for, at least a decade and a half before I started to realize exactly what was going on. And that is that, we may not simply be dealing with nuts and bolts spacecraft and flesh and blood aliens, but there's something else happening as well. And that the objects themselves seem to be constructed of a pure matter known as plasma, and that within these environments were entering into them a intelligence coming up from a deeper level of existence, somewhere that was outside of normal space-time, and that in many ways the objects themselves were sentient beings, and that these were the actual aliens, if you like. But of course the question then became, where are they coming from? Who are they? And why are they here? And what impact do they have on human civilization?
And we'll be touching upon those ultra-dimensionals a little later on in the interview. But it's interesting how you share that in your early work, the people who had the sightings and frequent sightings often also had paranormal events take place, seeing deceased relatives in spirit. I actually had that experience as a child, where one day I saw my grandfather in spirit, not knowing that he had passed, and having that confirmed for me a few hours later, and the following day having a UFO contact experience. Your book is dedicated to the memory of John Keel. For those who are not familiar, who was Mr. Keel, and how did he influence you and others in this field of discovery?
Well, John Keel was an explorer. I mean, he spent a lot of time in various countries looking at the folklore, the cryptids, the culture, and obviously the religion. But he also was a very prolific UFO investigator, clearly most famous for the work that he did at Point Pleasant, Virginia, West Virginia, on the whole Mothman story. I mean, one of his books was The Mothman Prophecies. It was obviously made into a blockbuster film. He also did, obviously, a series of other books as well, including things like The Eighth Tower, Operation Trojan Horse, and various other titles. And the importance about his work is that he thought differently to many other UFO writers, particularly during the 1970s, and obviously right through till his death, more recent times. And when I read his books, I realized that this psychic connection and this peculiarity about our relationship with this phenomena was something that he himself had recognized, and very few other writers were. I mean, there are loads of pulp paperbacks. I read them all on UFOs, and they were great fun. I really enjoyed reading them. Went on to the next one. But there are only a few authors whose work drew me back again and again. John Keel was certainly one of them. Jacques Vallée was another. And Brad Steiger was another. And all these seem to confirm to me that we weren't simply dealing with nuts and bolts spacecraft, flesh and blood aliens coming down here, that it was much, much more complex than that. And that we could be dealing with something which at the time people saw in terms of interdimensional contact, but today a better term that we use is transdimensional, and that we are dealing with what we see as n-dimensional beings, or n beings as we call them, which is the n standing for number, as in we don't know how many dimensions are involved. It could be 5, could be 11, could be 32, could be more than that. So, we call these intelligences n beings today.
Your new book, Origin of the Gods, is co-authored with Gregory Little, who also partnered with you on Denisovan Origins. How did you come to work with Gregory, and what does he share in Origin of the Gods?
Well, I first met Greg back and his lovely wife Laura back in the early 2000s. I went over to do a conference at the Edgar Cayce Foundation, the ARE, at West, where is it? Well, it's in Virginia, isn't it? He chaperoned me around, basically. We realised that we shared exactly the same opinion and attitudes towards the UFO phenomena, particularly to do with John Keel and the Mothman story. And, shortly after that time, we actually visited Point Pleasant, the first time I'd ever been there, to actually not only pay homage to the work that he did to do with Mothman as a huge, great metallic, Mothman actually in the town, which we obviously got photographs of, but also to try and talk to some of the people that had actually experienced or seen Mothman at the time. And we came across, the most extraordinary stories, which once again seemed to confirm the fact that you were dealing with an area that was very special, where not only did you have these Mothman sightings, but also, UFO sightings on a regular basis and other strange happenings, of course. And that Point Pleasant was a window area, something that we call today a portal, and that these portal locations can be found all over the world, and that there are certain patterns relating to their existence, most particularly to do with their intense geology. Often they're associated with the coming together or the movement of tectonic plates. They also very often are associated with fault lines, sort of the fractures in the underlying rock strata, which, move quite regularly. And also certain types of minerals, particularly quartz and tourmaline, which have the ability to be able to generate electricity very easily. And what that means is that they release electrons, and these electrons are able to reach the surface and create environments in which something known as ionization is able to take place very easily. And when this happens, these electrons, or so-called negative ions, will come together and get very excited, release photons of light, and be held within self-generated electromagnetic fields, which suddenly come to life like a light bulb being switched on, and suddenly you have an object of light right in front of you. And these can take various different forms. They can be large, they can be small, they can be solid, they can be nebulous, they can be fog-like. They can split in two, they can come back together, and they seem to have a type of sentience associated with them. People seem to believe that they come alive, and the component involved here is what's known as plasma. Plasma is created through these ionized environments, and these seem to take on their own identity, their own form, and may well be the explanation for quite a large number of UFOs. Not all, because obviously, we have to accept the fact that some UFOs, are genuine craft that come from, an interstellar origin. But definitely something else is going on in the background. And that's what I've been particularly interested in trying to understand.
And for our listeners not familiar with plasma, that's another state, isn't it?
Yes, plasma is known as the false state of matter. We have the other three states, which is gases, liquids, and solids. And obviously, we know that one essentially transforms into the other, depending on how fast they vibrate, basically. And what happens with plasma is that it goes beyond gas. I mean, some people just refer to it as ionized gas, but that does it a great disservice because it's actually a completely different state of matter. And various theoretical physicists have concluded that it may hold within it an extra dimension of space. And this is really, really important because obviously we exist in 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. But plasma environments may well have an extra dimension of space. And if that's the case, then they become like active doorways or gateways or portals into a higher dimensional realm. In other words, they themselves are the portal. And, they could be letting in things from other dimensional realms that coexist with us or are parallel with us or coincide or overlay with us on occasions. And this could explain everything from, light beings to shadow people to the appearance of cryptids, who all very often are associated with these environments that we call today portals, with places like Skinwalker Ranch in Utah being an obvious example, a showcase example today of what a portal is.
And Skinwalker Ranch also has that geological fault, doesn't it?
Yeah, you see, as I said, if you're looking for portal locations, which in the past were referred to as window areas, you're looking for certain types of features which will come up again and again and again. And these will generally involve a very intense geology to do with tectonic plates, fault lines, and the fact that those fault lines will generate a hell of a lot of pressure in the substrata, the rocks below our feet. And as I said, this will generate electricity. Now, it doesn't sound very important, but it is. It's incredibly important because it creates the right environment for UFOs to manifest. And it goes back to the 1950s. People realized that there were certain places where UFOs seemed to appear more than anywhere else. And people like John Keel wrote about this and about so-called window areas like Point Pleasant in West Virginia. And we're starting to realize that, that there's something scientific going on here. This is not simply the fact that objects coming in from some star system like to arrive at a certain point, that the environments surrounding these portal locations are absolutely correct. And if you go to Skinwalker Ranch, which I was able to do during the writing of the book and spent a couple of days there talking with everybody involved, I was able to get a very, very good picture of what was happening there. I mean, because not only have you got large amounts of UFO sightings taking place. I spoke to workers there who had no real interest in UFOs at all. And all of them had stories to tell about objects that would suddenly manifest overhead, objects that would fly at low level over the northern mesa there, and other, weird things that would happen to their electrical apparatus, smartphones, things like this. So there's no question that big things were going on there and still do to this day. But yes, once I started looking into it, and I was there actually with a geologist, and he actually produced a map and actually showed me that there was a fault line in the western part of the northern mesa, which is where most of the paranormal phenomena actually takes place. Most of the UFO sightings occur. And I reproduced this in the book Origins of the Gods, but the actual northern mesa itself is made of a type of sandstone, which is very high in quartz content. And this quartz powders due to weather erosion, and the whole area there is covered in this really fine powder. And you have to wear scarves so that this powder, which is very tiny fragments of quartz, doesn't get in your throat and obviously into your lungs. But this is perfect environments for the production of electrons and electronic environments, essentially. And once you realize this, everything then starts to fall into place as to why so much activity is going on there.
Now, on the History Channel series, The Curse of Skinwalker Ranch, every time one of these anomalies takes place, there is really measurable electromagnetic anomalies, which you have discussed. Is that something that you think is connected to the paranormal?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Skinwalker Ranch is almost, if you can think of a haunted house and the type of phenomena that takes place there, particularly I'm talking about poltergeist phenomena, things being moved around, whether, you see it or it happens, behind your back, or mysterious lights that occur in haunted houses, communication, the sense that there is a presence there. Skinwalker Ranch is like a big version of that. It's like a huge haunted house. But what's so interesting is that at Skinwalker, just as it is at other polter locations, particularly Bempton, which is the UK version of Skinwalker Ranch up in the north of the country, is that the investigators involved believe that everything that's happening is part of the presence of a single entity, and that everything is the product of almost like a hive mind, and that entity is aware of your presence and has built up its power, if you like, over a very long period of time. Now, what's so interesting is that both at Skinwalker Ranch and at Bempton, they call it exactly the same. I mean, quite separately, and that's the host. I mean, they've got other names for it as well. And they believe that it reacts, it responds, it appears, it does what it wants when it wants to do it. And it's not like a performing monkey. In other words, you can't really, try and do something and just conjure it into existence. It does exactly what it wants. It is a very powerful, intelligent being. We call them Egregors. And the term Egregor was originally coined to explain the idea of creating a thought form. A thought form that would then take on its own life and have an independent existence. Well, I'm not saying that the entities associated with these portal locations are made up by us, but they're certainly fed by human consciousness interaction over a very long period of time. Both Bempton and Skinwalker Ranch have had ritualistic activity taking place for many, many thousands of years. I mean, Skinwalker Ranch was a sacred land before it was, taken over essentially by some of the local tribal peoples in the 19th century. Before that time, it was like a no man's land between different tribes, and they would go there to do their sacred rituals. I mean, there are sacred places there, there's rock art. And obviously, as we know from reading books on Skinwalker Ranch and watching the TV show, that Native Americans talk about the so-called path of the Skinwalker there. And that is the length of the northern mesa, corresponding, I would say, very well with the actual trend or direction of the fault line. In other words, the Native American peoples actually believe that the phenomena takes place in accordance with exactly the same path that the fault line takes. And I'm sure they were not aware of that before they made, that decision to create it and call it that.
We're speaking with Andrew Collins. We're talking about his book in partnership with Gregory Little, Origins of the Gods. Andrew, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and this fascinating work.
Yes, the book can be obtained from any good online bookstore, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I'd like to think it's in a few real shops in the States, but, the most obvious place is to find it online. But if you want more information about it, just go on to andrewcollins.com, where there's a complete breakdown of the book and its contents as well.
And we'll be back with Andrew after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. a philanthropic organization. Their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Andrew Collins, the new book, Origins of the Gods. Andrew, in our first segment, you sort of alluded to this, and I want to talk about this a little deeper. Your collective work is opening this new paradigm in our understanding of what our earliest ancestors experienced and expands upon the ancient aliens' extraterrestrial theory with transdimensional or ultra-terrestrial beings. Give us a little more on that. Who are these beings? Where do they come from?
Well, I mean, obviously, we all know about UFOs. The first thing that we think of is, that they are, alien spaceships, essentially. And this has been there, obviously, since the 40s and the Roswell incident and stuff like that. But it's very clear that something else is going on in the background, because the idea of physical craft coming here does not explain a lot of what happens, as we've already talked about. So I started to think, well, is there an alternative answer? And at the beginning of the 1990s, I got quite heavily involved with crop circles and visiting them and experiencing them. And I started to write a book called, what was it called? The Circle Makers. That's right. It came out in 1992. And I was writing that, and I was thinking about the fact that I'd been involved with a UFO case in Essex, which is the county I live in, which is just outside of London, where a whole family of 5 had been driving along a road, and they'd seen this UFO crossover, which took the form of this oval-shaped blue light. And, they were excited. They saw it. They thought that the sighting was over. But then the car headlights failed, the engine failed, and they could no longer hear the tyres rolling over the ground, the road. And as they turned the corner, they saw this luminous bank of green mist completely engulfing the road. And they entered inside this, and everything suddenly stopped. They felt quite nauseous. And then the next thing they know, they're 3/4 of a mile further on the same road. And they get home from this very short journey, which was only 20 minutes of length. And they find that 3 hours are missing from their life. Now, obviously, this seriously troubled them, but they decided not to say anything. But they had a few weird dreams about being in bright rooms with weird gnome-like entities present, but they just ignored it for 3 years. And eventually they reached out to the UFO community, and I was, appointed to investigate the case. And these people are genuine, no question about that. And they lost 3 hours. There's no question. I got a hypnotist involved who regressed them, certainly the male of the family, John Day, and an on-board experience was revealed. Now, that was it. I mean, I wrote it all up for Flying Saucer Review. It was in 2 parts, and I've written about it in various books. But the important thing is that there were certain points about this that didn't add up. And that was, firstly, the fact that when the family went into this luminous green mist, 2 of the children were asleep in the back of the car, and the third one, the eldest, was standing up with his hands on the passenger and the driver's seat. And when they came out 3/4 of a mile further on, and obviously 3 hours later, everybody was in exactly the same position. And you think, well, how is that possible? I mean, were the aliens that caring that they put everybody back in exactly the same position so that, it looked like nothing had happened? Or was there another possibility that they jumped space-time? In other words, they hadn't spent the time, the 3 hours anywhere in this realm. They just jumped space-time. They jumped 3 hours and they jumped 3/4 of a mile. and that anything that happened to them during that time, where they firmly believed that there was an intelligence involved, and it did communicate with them, and it remained in connection with them afterwards, was something which was, and the identity of it was almost being fed by what they expected to happen under such circumstances. In other words, if they believed that they were being abducted, they would see the interior of a spacecraft, and the entities would reflect that. Whereas we know that in the past, almost identical events took place where people would lose time, and they would say they went into the fairy realm and were dancing with the fairies, or they would be taken to heaven and shown paradise, by Jesus himself, or they would be carried out, by angels or something like this. So in other words, was this a product of our modern day technological belief in the idea of, aliens coming down here? And so I began to think that these intelligences were themselves of outside of normal space time. And if that's the case, who were they? Well, as we now know that these environments can contain a higher dimensional state, was it possible that we are dealing with transdimensional intelligences as opposed to flesh and blood aliens, and that they could take any form that they wanted? If they wanted to take the form of, aliens, whether they be tall, whether they be small, like alien grains, they could do. And that, in other words, when you enter into this type of environment, which I called a bubble universe, that you're almost like a dreamscape that was being made up as you went along. In other words, every room that you went into was a product of your thought and your connection, your interrelationship, your entanglement with the intelligence that you were dealing with. And then obviously after a certain amount of time, you were then sort of put back into normal space time, and suddenly this 3 hours is missing. Because that was the other thing. In many, many cases of abductions, the amount of time that people say that the experience occurred, in other words, that they were on board, does not match at all the time that they are lost from reality. I mean, for instance, the famous Travis Walton case, for instance, of Arizona from, I think, 1975. I mean, he has a recall of being on board for, a very short period of time. Obviously, when he comes back to reality, several days are missing. And we know from folklore that there are many cases where people see this light, often associated with like a mound or a barrow, a prehistoric mound or a barrow, which isn't normally there. They go into the light, almost like a doorway. They see the fairies dancing around. They may dance with the fairies for an hour, and they come out and days are missing. And in some accounts, years are missing even. And so are we being taken out of normal space-time into a higher dimensional environment during some abductions, not all, obviously, some abductions, and that this interrelationship then occurs between us and these intelligences that are reflective of our beliefs and expectancies of what we assume is going to happen under such times. That's what I concluded. And I wrote about this initially in the book The Circle Makers, but have since written about it in a book called Alien Energy, and also obviously in the most recent book, but also in a book called Light Quest, which came out in 2012, which is my sort of open magnus on UFOs, really.
So they manifest what we preconceive in our consciousness.
For the most part, yeah. And it's both individual, based on what the individual has in their own mind, but I think collective as well. I think that we're also dealing with a collective unconscious, because, obviously some people would say, well, yeah, but people out in, remote forests, are abducted by aliens and they see the same. Well, yes, but that is a product of a collective unconscious that is mixed with the indigenous beliefs of the local people at the same time. So, we are dealing with not just the individual mind, but the collective mind of, humanity, but also you're dealing with completely separate intelligences, a third force, if you like. And that third force, I think, is multidimensional in nature and essentially doesn't need a body at all. It is energy. It is pure energy that exists on a higher dimensional state, but that can interact with us through plasma environments. And also it can communicate with us through altered states of consciousness and shamanism.
Which leads to the wonderful manifestations we have witnessed in our respective lifetimes, the convergence of science, specifically quantum physics, and what has been called paranormal or spiritual. What is science now saying about what Einstein called spooky action at a distance?
We all know about subjects like telepathy, mind over matter, precognition, premonitions. And of course, these have been studied by groups like Society of Psychical Research and other paranormal or parapsychologists, for hundreds of years, of course. But they're still dismissed as fringe subjects that have no real scientific basis in fact. But we now know that quantum theory provides answers to all of these. And that is the subject of quantum entanglement. Entanglement is the idea that particles can become twinned. And I mean, every particle can become twinned, but particularly things like electrons and photons. And once they become twinned, they can go to the opposite ends of the universe and still retain a instantaneous link with each other. In other words, if you do an experiment on one and tweak it, the other twinned particle will move in the equal and opposite direction at the same time. And this can be measured. And if you are now thinking in whole systems of entangled particles, where you have, one half of them over here, let's say in my head, and the other half of them in your head, and they're doing the same dance. In other words, they're doing the same movement, same patterns, then this is the transfer of information. And indeed, this is the mechanism that we are going to be using to collect and use and store data and program in quantum computers in the future. And that will use quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement, therefore, becomes a very real possible explanation for telepathy, but also mind over matter, because quite clearly, if particles in your head are doing the same dance in somebody else's head, you can quite clearly manipulate that person as well. In other words, they can think like you and maybe act like you and do things based on what's going on in your own head. And of course, this we know as spells, prayers, positive thinking. All of these ideas suddenly become a reality if you start employing the idea of quantum entanglement. But it's not just between human beings or the macrocosmic world in general. But if you think that these plasma constructs, these objects, are also made of electrons, where our whole system, our brain, our nervous system, all the rest of it operates through the transfer of electrons within the body, which are incredibly important. Electricity is very important within our body, the way that it functions. Then quite clearly, some of the electrons in us is going to be reflective of their counterparts, their twins, within these plasma environments. And that means that a communication, a communion, an entanglement can very easily exist between you and the phenomena. And if that's the case, it begins to explain why, when people observe these objects, they move in response to human consciousness interaction, and why we feel a deep connection with them. The other important thing about entanglement is it doesn't have to be all in the here and now, because on a subatomic level, on a quantum level, there is no real such thing as time, or certainly not in the way that we think of it, that one entangled particle could go into the future and the other one could go into the past. And if you think that that also is happening all the time, then entanglement can work outside of normal time and could explain phenomena like precognition. I mean, you think of precognition. I mean, a good example of that would be somebody in a car driving along. They suddenly get a premonition that there's a crash about to occur. So they pull over, or they don't pull over, depending on how they react. And sure enough, 5 minutes further down the road, a crash occurred exactly as their mind had seen it. And what's going on here? Well, there is every possibility that we can be entangled with our own future selves. And that information can then be sent back from the future, or a linear possibility of our future, to us, with the opportunity that we can then, take a different path or stop or do whatever. And I think that this is something that was quite primal, and that was inherent within humanity at the beginning, and possibly is even there within animals, that we have the ability to know what's about to occur, any danger in front of us. And I think that this was hardwired into us at the beginning, and that this explains both premonitions and precognition. So that's what entanglement is. And if that's the case, then UFOs can operate outside of normal space-time. In other words, their mind, their consciousness is not just in the here and now, but it can be in the past, the present, and the future all at the same time. And this would ably explain why, when people connect with a UFO, they feel that they know the intelligence, that the intelligence has been there all their life and thereafter remains with them for the rest of their life. And many UFO witnesses spend a lot of time trying to reconnect with the intelligence that they feel is associated with the phenomena they've seen. I mean, I've known people that have spent half their life trying to reconnect with the object which they saw in terms of sentience in nature. And, they feel that connection, but it influences them. They feel that intelligence is still there. And often they benefit from it. They become very creative. They become musicians. They become writers, poets, artists, sculptors. I mean, I see this so much. And it all begins with that connection that they make with that phenomena.
My guest is Andrew Collins. His new book, in conjunction with Gregory Little, Origins of the Gods. We'll be back with more after these words on the OMTimes radio network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hey, son. How are you feeling?
I'm fine, Pops.
What's on your mind?
I can't explain it. Navigating without a compass, eyes waiting, started to wonder. Metamorphosis, the loss of who you thought you was.
When your kid can't find the language, help them find the lyrics. Listen to the Sound It Out album and get tips and tools to start a conversation at sounditouttogether.org. Brought to you by Ad Council and Pivotal Ventures.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Andrew Collins. We're talking about his collaborative effort with Gregory Little, the new book, Origins of the Gods. In Origins of the Gods, you and Gregory show a commonality of spiritual experience between the ancient indigenous peoples of North America and those of Africa and the Middle East. Who were the ancient shamans, and who or what inspired them?
Well, we've been talking about psychically sensitive people, and they're the ones that would seem to be able to connect with this phenomena, connect with the intelligences involved more easily than some others. And of course, in indigenous cultures worldwide, going back to the beginning of humanity, there have been certain people that have been able to make that link more easily than others. And we generally refer to them as shamans, basically. And the earliest evidence of shamanism anywhere in the world was recently discovered at a place called the Qesem Cave in Israel, just outside of Tel Aviv. And this comes in the form of a swan wing bone. And the wing bones were very important for shamans to collect and use, because obviously this is what gave the bird flight. And what it was believed, and is still believed today in many parts of the world, is that by having the wing bone of a bird, you can attain astral flight or shamanic flight whilst in a trance state or an altered state of consciousness, during rituals and during ceremonies. And this is exactly what was going on at the Qesem Cave 400,000 years ago. That's the earliest evidence of shamanism that we've got. This was revealed in 2019, and I go into this in great detail in the book and in my section. But what's also of interest is that the Qesem people, as I call them, were also becoming the smartest people in the world at this same time that they were writing the book on shamanism. I mean, for instance, they created the earliest what's being described as canned food. And what I mean by that is that they would chop the legs off deer and immediately wrap them in such a manner that the very nutritious marrow in the bone could be preserved for a period of months, and they could just chuck it in their backpack and go off on their journeys and have ready meals at the waiting. They also created the earliest freezers, basically, in the form of they would get fresh meat and they would freeze them by using, I say the word freeze, I don't mean in our sense, but they would preserve food using ash in such a way that would also preserve it for a number of weeks so that they could come back to use it. They also had the first production lines of beautiful stone tools known as blades. And these were just a whole production line of these beautiful tools. They also had a school of rock where pupils could come in and learn the trade of being able to make these tools in different parts of the cave. They were the earliest peoples to use sustained fire in a fire pit at the same location for not just thousands but possibly tens of thousands or more years, and many more things like this. Now, this might not seem a lot to us, but these were innovations that were making these people the smartest people on the planet, and it cannot be a coincidence. At the same time, they're also inventing shamanism. And the archaeologists involved with the excavations at the site, which have been going on only since the year 2001, are convinced that the idea of this shamanism was to enter into the other world and communicate with otherworldly intelligences, which they would probably have seen in terms of their ancestors, their direct ancestors, but also the spirits of the animals that they killed during the hunt. You know, a little bit like, you know, Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. You know, we've obviously all seen the film. We've all seen how the animals are able to talk amongst themselves and to human beings. If you can imagine that as an otherworldly environment, that seemingly is what the Qesem cave people were trying to enter and were able to make the communications. But I think that what was going on was something far more profound, because quite close to the Qesem cave on the horizon is a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And Mount Gerizim is very important in the early part of the Bible because it was seen as the mountain of God, the dwelling place of God. The God that was the God of the Israelites that would eventually become the God Yahweh that would be encountered by Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. But we're talking about another mountain called Mount Gerizim, which is currently in the Palestinian West Bank, not far from Tel Aviv, which is obviously in Israel. And it overlooks the modern Palestinian city of Nablus, which was ancient Shechem in the Bible. This is where it all happened for the early patriarchs of the Bible, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and it was the first place that the Israelites went to, now under the command of Joshua, after they left the land of Sinai, crossed the Jordan River and entered the promised land of Canaan. The first place they went to, or settled at least, was Shechem, right beneath Mount Gerizim, and they carried out this massive, great ritual there known as the ceremony of the curses and the blessings, which is described in great detail in the book that involved the Ark of the Covenant. And the reason why I'm saying all this is that the mountain itself is well known for strange light phenomena. The Samaritans, who are the people that live around the mountain today and who claim to be the direct descendants of the Israelites, talk about God manifesting on the mountain as the Shekinah, which means the presence of God. But what this more specifically is recognized as being is the light of God, God appearing like this blinding light or this devouring fire, just like Moses himself saw on the top of Mount Sinai. In other words, we're dealing with some kind of strange light phenomena that was being recognized by the early Israelites as God manifesting. And this is where God manifests on his own seat, in his own house, as it were. So anyway, I looked into Mount Gerizim and I found that not only does it have very intense geology involving tectonic plates, fault lines, the right types of minerals that we've talked about in connection with production of electricity and thus light and plasma, but that modern sightings have been reported there. And I actually went there. I went to the Qesem Cave to talk to the archaeologists and went from there into the Palestinian West Bank and climbed the mountain and talked to one of the highest ranking Samaritan priests there. And we talked about the importance of the place. And I then got on to, mysterious lights, what we'd call UFOs today. And I said, do these things still appear? They said, oh, yes, absolutely. I said, what are they? What are they seen as today? And he said, malach, which I knew was the Arabic for angels. In other words, what we call UFOs, and many people assume to be alien spaceships, to these people, they are the messengers of God manifesting on the mountain. And I mean, this is quite remarkable, that you still have this phenomenon and it's still interpreted in a way which it almost certainly was for thousands of years. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. But we can take this one step further now, because can we dare to suggest that the Qesem people, as much as 400,000 years ago, were also aware of these lights and connected with them, saw them as the manifestation of some kind of intelligence, some kind of entity, some kind of egregor that they felt could benefit their community if they appeased them with offerings in some way? And did they also believe that once they had made contact with these UFOs, perhaps through encounters like we have today, that they continued to have this relationship with this intelligence through the shamanic experiences, and that this intelligence was giving them innovations and technology, just in the same way that we know that a lot of people that have close encounters of UFOs today go on to be incredibly creative and innovative in their own right. Was this going on as early as 400,000 years ago? And I think the answer was definitely yes.
Origins of the Gods, Qesem Cave, Skinwalkers, and contact with transdimensional intelligences. My guest, Andrew Collins. Andrew, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you and this fascinating work.
Yes, you can obviously buy the book on any good online bookstore, such as Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And if you want to know more about the book, read an introduction, go to andrewcollins.com and just click open that and read about it, on the opening page. You can click there's lots of information.
Andrew, on behalf of our listeners, my gratitude for your joining us today and sharing this fascinating work in your career with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Victor.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.